Good morning, everyone. Welcome to SmartKnowledgeU Podcast number 5, Everything That Is Wrong with Banks Today. Today's SmartKnowledgeU Podcast is brought to you by Audible.com, where you can download over 150,000 titles for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, and MP3 player. You can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial by visiting www.audibletrial.com/SmartKnowledgeU. Tremendous audiobook to further explore the topic of today's podcast is The Big Short, Inside the Doomsday Machine by Michael Lewis. And you can download this audiobook for free or any other book of your choosing at audibletrial.com/SmartKnowledgeU. Or if you like to support me as we bring all these podcasts to you for absolutely no charge, please go to lulu.com, Lulu.com, and purchase my book, The Golden Gift, which addresses in great detail a lot of the topics that we talk about in our podcast. So before I get started with today's podcast, Everything That Is Wrong with Banks Today, I would like to ask your opinion on future podcast topics. So if you're listening to this on YouTube, please comment below in the comment section, and we will take the most requested topics and try to address them in future podcasts. So please let us know what you would like me to address as far as topically what's going on, anything to do with gold, silver, global markets, etc. And as I started these podcasts to try to counter the massive propaganda that now exists in all mainstream news, if you appreciate the work I'm putting in to bring you these podcasts for free, please do forward them on to all your friends that may enjoy them as well, because the idea here is that we are part of the truth movement, and in order for me to spend hours for making each of these podcasts for it to be worth my time, I really would like the information that I'm putting out there to reach as many people as possible. So please do support us in that manner and help us continue our podcast into the future, because they do take quite a lot of time to aggregate the research that we put into it, as well as just on this minimal production scale, it takes me several hours to produce one podcast. So obviously today, to keep this podcast to about an hour or so, I can't address everything that's wrong with banks, otherwise we may still be here after 24 hours, but I am going to try to summarize the main facets of banking that are problematic and truly concerning and troublesome today. So I know some of you have asked for more production, more photos, and references listed on the screen on YouTube as I speak about them, rather than just aggregated in the podcast description. But there's many people that have popular podcasts, that's how they make their living. This is not how I make my living, as I haven't received a dime off of any of these podcasts. So quite honestly and frankly, I barely have enough time to produce these podcasts as they are. And fortunately, I don't have 8 hours to spend on each podcast to improve production. So I still do hope that this information is worth it to everyone. So let's begin. I'm just going to go off a list. There's so many things wrong with banking today, so I'm going to just go off a list from the top of my head, and the order in which I speak about them is not necessarily an order of importance that I assign to them. So let's just start off. The first problem I see with the banking industry are actually many of the bankers themselves, and I'm going to tell you an anecdotal story to kind of back up this claim. I recall recently talking to a banker that worked for HSBC, and this was right after HSBC had been outed for laundering over $7 billion for the very, very violent and destructive Mexican Sinaloa drug cartel. And I asked her how she could work for such a criminal bank, as they have always been the bank of choice throughout history for drug laundering cartels. And in fact, if you go back to their history, I believe they were founded in the 1700s. They were actually founded by a couple of British drug laundering people that founded HSBC as a means to have a bank to launder the massive profits of the British opium trade in China. And today they continue to launder massive profits for the criminal underworld. So just to discuss a very, very short list of the very long list of crimes HSBC has committed in recent years. Again, that included the $7 billion the Sinaloa drug cartel proceeds that they laundered and made extreme amounts of money from. And that's only the money they got caught laundering. So you have to imagine that they probably laundered tens and tens of billions of dollars for the Sinaloa drug cartel over the years. And that's a cartel that has murdered tens of thousands of people. And then in recent years, they are also caught laundering $290 million for the Russian mafia. So in essence, the line between the criminal underworld and HSBC is nearly indistinguishable. So when I asked this woman, who was a high-level executive at HSBC, how she could justify working for a large bank that is essentially a front for legalized crime, she replied, "I didn't launder any of that money. I didn't murder anyone, so I don't see how that's my problem." And I told her that the most prominent anti-money laundering officers in the entire world that have studied the huge role big global banks like HSBC play in aiding and abetting crime, that they have stated, one such character is Martin Woods, and he has stated, quote, "If you don't see the correlation between the money laundering by banks and the 30,000 people killed in Mexico," and actually, if we include the people murdered by Mexican drug cartels since 2006, it's actually well over 80,000, not just 30,000 people. He said, "You're missing the point," end quote. So I told her what this prominent anti-money laundering officer thought of the raw HSBC employees have in this great big global crime syndicate. And she replied, again, "I didn't murder anyone." If that excuse is an exculpatory excuse for remaining an employee of a bank that serves as a front for massive criminal activity. So to this, I said, "Do you mean to tell me it's okay then to rationalize $1 million salary from a mob boss if that salary came from serving as an accountant for him? Because I'm not hurting anyone, right? If I don't personally commit, say, any of the 3,000 murders he orders a year, that's okay." And when I made this comparison, she said, "That's a ridiculous comparison." But I said, apparently the top money laundering experts in the entire world, like Martin Woods, do not think it's a ridiculous comparison, and they think it's a perfect comparison. So as we see like a very high-level executive at HSBC, just from my knowledge of global banking salaries, having been a banking industry insider at one point in my career many years ago, over a decade ago, I believe that this woman's salary was anywhere from $500,000 to several $1 million a year. So the problem is that many bankers, they know they're working for criminal organizations. They don't want to open their eyes and see the truth because they don't want to give up these huge salaries to do the right thing and to help humanity. And as muckraker Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, the infamous and seminal book, The Jungle, in the 1920s, I believe it was, he said, I'm paraphrasing, that the hardest truth for anyone to see is a truth in which their salary depends upon believing in a lie. So that, to me, was this HSBC banker. So one of the biggest problems with banking today are the very people that work for these institutions. Now, I'm not saying everyone is like this woman, but I'm saying the majority, maybe even 90%, I would estimate, are like this woman. And I can say that because, again, I work for one of the largest banks in the U.S., for one of the largest wealth management divisions of a U.S. bank for years before I finally quit and discussed over 10 years ago. So I know the lack of conscience and that money rules everything type of attitude that many of these bank employees have. So let's move on to the next thing I think is really wrong with banking today. Well, if you look at banks all over the world, they're starting to actually provide negative interest rate yields and institutional deposit accounts. Now, Switzerland, if we look at the bond market, they're actually issuing negative interest rate 10-year bonds. So who would be dumb enough to tie up their money for 10-year bonds for a guaranteed loss? And that's just a nominal loss because they're charging negative interest rates. But when you take into account the devaluation of the Swiss franc, since they took the Swiss franc from 40% gold back to 20% gold back to 17% gold back, and I think I'm not positive, so you have to look this up. I'm saying off the top of my head, so I'll tell you when I'm not positive. I think it's down to like around 11% gold back now. It's obviously going to devalue more in the future. So you're basically going to pay bank to buy a bond for guaranteed loss 10 years out. That is crazy. Because it was only about 35 years ago that banks used to pay 6%, American banks, on a savings account. Now they want to charge you to keep money in their bank. So if we look at what's going on specifically, like JP Morgan Chase recently announced that it could charge institutional clients as much as 5.5% on certain deposits. And that is because they want to push about $100 billion of these deposits out the door, because they don't want to pay to hold deposits, because they can get basically money almost for free from the U.S. Federal Reserve. And that's why European banks are doing the same thing. They can get money basically for free from the European Central Bank. So it doesn't make any sense for them to hold retail or institutional money anymore. So what this shows us is that banks are no longer banks, but they're a huge risky hedge fund. And actually they've been like that for years, because it was this very operational model upon which they function that caused the 2008 economic crash, and what's going to cause an even more massive crash in the very near future. So it's crazy, because when I've done my research into the last bank that really acted like a bank, meaning it held your deposits, it had anyone could walk in and withdraw 100% of the deposits at any time, because it was always there. And in fact, the last bank I found like this had more than 100% of deposits, because they made very low risk, high reward loans and made money off of those. So they actually had more than 100% of deposits almost at all times. Was a 1609 Municipal Bank of Amsterdam. So that's how insane the banking industry is today. It basically devolved away from a sound banking model to run a totally fraudulent, criminal, and gambling model that we have today. So, as I say in all my podcasts, all my videos, no one should ever blindly accept the information I provide, but go to the links I provide on the YouTube podcast version, independently perform your own research and draw your own conclusions, because I've always been a huge proponent of active learning, because I think active learning rather than passive learning, which means you just absorb information someone else is telling you and blindly accept it as the truth. Active learning, on the other hand, where you actually are going out and using your own critical thinking skills to assess what you've heard as either true or not true, is exponentially more effective in discovering and learning the truth. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions that are raised by the information I provide in this podcast, and I'm not going to answer all of the questions raised by the information I'm providing, even though I know the answers, because I truly do want everyone to understand as much as possible the truths I'm laying out here in today's podcast. So, again, if you engage in active learning, you're actually more apt to spread this information to your friends as well. So that's the kind of truth movement that we all need to be a part of. We all need to spread the truth to as many people as possible once we hear it, not just keep it to ourselves. So, along with the fact that bankers basically don't want to pay anything to hold deposits anymore. They don't even want customers to use cash today. So a lot of European banks have already restricted daily withdrawals to 1,000 euros a day. So in some countries, it used to be 3,000 euros a day. I think it was France. Again, I'm not positive off the top of my head, but I do believe it was France. And they actually ratcheted that down from 3,000 to 1,000 euros a day. So imagine if you're a fairly wealthy person, or I guess in this type of economy, a very wealthy person that has 5 million euros. It would take you 5,000 days to get your money out. Or what is that? I don't know, maybe roughly 5,000 days, 365 days a year times 10 is 3,650 days. So another 1,500 days on top of that. So nearly 14 years, I think, just doing a calculation quick, 14 years to get all your cash out if you want cash and you don't trust digital currencies. That is ridiculous. So they're actually starting to impose these intense and really tyrannical capital controls upon all of us. JP Morgan says clients cannot use cash to pay auto loans, credit cards, mortgages, cannot store any cash in their safe deposit boxes. Last year, some HSBC customers informed media that they had been prevented from withdrawing large amounts of cash, which were defined as just 5,000 to 10,000 euros. without providing evidence of why they wanted it. So they couldn't even get their own cash without providing in writing, not even verbally, in writing. They had to write a letter to tell HSBC why they wanted their own cash. And I think there was so much backlash from that I believe HSBC eventually withdrew that policy. But you can see the tyranny that is going on. So, there's a top Citibank banker, I believe he's their gold consultant, that has also stated that all banks should ban the use of cash. So why do banks want to turn all money digital? It's really funny because people don't really pay, and I'm sure people are not even paying attention to this when it happens, because there's so much propaganda out there that prevents people from seeing the truth and seeing the devastation that is coming, being able to properly analyze the truth and what is the meaning of this truth. Because I predicted nearly 3 years ago, because I predicted in June of 2012 and it's only May. So 2 years and 11 months ago, I predicted that this would happen. And I wrote an article on my blog, which you can find at www.smartknowledgeu.com, and then clicking on the blog link. And it was called The Criminal Banking Cartel's End Game, 100% Digital Money. So again, I'll put the link on the YouTube video description, but you can just go to my blog and search June 2012 archives. You'll find it easily. But I noted back then that massive propaganda was taking place in the mass media, and that there are articles being distributed by Time Magazine, Wire Magazine, UK Telegraph, amongst numerous other mass media distribution outlets that basically consisted of articles that bashed the utility of cash and said we don't need cash anymore. We just need digital currencies, and they were pushing this agenda 3 years ago. So I knew the bankers would eventually start enforcing this as well. And what is the end game? Well, if you go to my article, just go to my website, find the article, and I tell you what I believe their end game to be, why they're pushing this cashless 100% digital currency agenda. So I also mentioned that when the bankers started pushing this ban of cash, which they're doing now, they would push it because of certain triggers they're seeing in the global economy. So I believe these triggers are now manifesting, and these triggers, if you go read my article, are extremely, extremely worrisome. So you should go check out my article, and I tell you what I believe the rationale behind bankers banning cash right now is, and it's not good. So going back to my first point, banks, basically, there's a problem just how the industry has been, or my second point, of how the industry has been structured, because they're basically legalized criminal racketeering organizations today that all could easily be processed under the RICO Act in the United States. So not only are most bank employees problematic in that all they care about is money, and as long as they're making tons of money, they won't quit, they won't exit the system, and they'll play integral, supportive role and destructive role in tearing apart the fabric of our society. But in the end, the banks themselves are extremely problematic, because if the bank industry and how they structured themselves wasn't problematic, then it wouldn't be problematic for any employee to work there. So nearly all the cash the global banking system has a circulation today is from the criminal underworld. So Antonio Maria Costa, the head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, says he has seen evidence that the proceeds of organized crime were, quote, the only liquid investment capital, end quote, to some banks during the global economic crisis in 2008. Now, that is an incredible statement, and let me tell you why that is an incredible statement. Because he said the majority of the $352 billion of drug profits was absorbed into the economic system in 2007 and 2008 as a result of the problems that banks were having with liquidity during that economic crisis. So he said, quote, in many instances, the money from drugs was the only liquid investment capital. In the second half of 2008, liquidity was the banking system's main problem, and hence liquid capital became an important factor, end quote. So he said some of the evidence put before his office indicated that drug cartel and mafia money was used to save some banks from collapse when lending seized up. And this brings me back to my point that banks have long stopped being banks, and the last honest bank, incredibly, I could find was more than 400 years ago. So there should never be a case, banks wouldn't have a liquidity problem if they didn't gamble with all the money, all the clients' money that's deposited there. But now they just become like huge hedge funds that have gambled so much with clients' money and have lost so much money, expect taxpayers to provide the bailouts and increase taxes on the people to recapitalize them, and that they must depend now on criminal money to survive. And that is that's a problem with the banking industry itself, is that it is not an honest industry. It has basically transformed into a completely criminal and despicable industry. So media, the problem is also media. The problem why a lot of people will be skeptical of all this information I'm presenting in today's podcast is because the media blacks out truth. Now, why would the media black out truth? Because the bankers own most of the media too. The bankers and industrialists. I should include industrialists in that, like Rupert Murdoch and whatnot. But in the last podcast, I spoke about how all political and war-related news distributed by the mass media has become official state-sponsored propaganda, no matter what country this news is emanating from. But sadly today, the same is now true for all financial news. And I shouldn't say today because it's been like that for at least the past couple of decades. So if you have a hard time believing this again, and I welcome skepticism. Skepticism is healthy, so please be skeptical and perform your own research. But please do go to our LinkedIn group called SmartKnowledgeU Gold and Silver Wealth Preservation Strategies, because I posted several discussions in recent weeks about how deceitful all financial news is today, and I explain how the mass media is deceitful about all financial news today. If you want just the simple link, again, I'll post the link to the group. You can join our group, be notified of all the discussions I post there by looking at the link in the YouTube video description. So it's very interesting what's going on in the media today, because back in 2013, the person that did the marketing for my company submitted an article to Outbrain as part of our marketing efforts about the merits of sound money over fiat currency, and why the continued use of fiat currencies, the continued QE efforts of central bankers all around the world would lead to catastrophic systemic problems within the global banking and system and all the other capital markets as well, and eventually lead to periodic market crashes. And I also, within the same article, described all the problems I had with Bitcoin. And then since then, almost everything I wrote in that article, just like I predicted in 2012 that bankers would try to move us all to a cashless society, has now come to fruition. And in fact, I believe had Outbrain actually accepted my article, a lot of Bitcoin investors would have been saved from Bitcoin's fall in 2014 from nearly $1,200 an ounce. I think it was 11 something was the height of Bitcoin's price, to now I think it's around $240 or so, $240. So if they just read my article, I believe a lot of people would have been helped out. But this is a response I received from Outbrain. I actually saved that email, so I'm going to read you exactly what they wrote me. They said, quote, "Thanks very much for signing up with Amplify Do It Yourself," which is the Outbrain way of promoting articles. He said, "Unfortunately, we can't accept and amplify your content across our publisher sites. We've had several complaints about this category type of content from our audiences, editors, and publishers." So that is just sorry. Outbrain's a joke, because they saw it upon themselves as their job to censor the truth. And it's funny, I guess the content of my article is too offensive to propaganda pushers like Outbrain that don't want the opposition of truth, or perhaps are only open to controlled opposition, which is basically more propaganda. Because today I went to, you see Outbrain all the time of their promoted articles on news aggregator websites. So I went to a site today, and these are articles that they're pushing. "Pro wrestling gorilla goes for the gut." That's one headline. Second headline: "New Jersey rabbis convicted of conspiring to kidnap husbands, force them to divorce wives." It's just like total mindless garbage and rubbish that they push, and they were not opening to accepting an article of mine that I was actually going to pay them to promote just because it was too offensive to them. So they had to censor it because there was too many factual evidence in it. And it obviously is factual because everything I wrote in the article has now since come true. So when we look at it, it's not just a problem of companies like Outbrain that censor truth. Also, Google has engaged in massive censorship of truth as well. Because here again, I'm going to bring up some information that I kept records of. So I published an article in January of 2012, only 3 years ago, January 22nd, titled, "Did Bankers Deliberately Crash MF Global to Crash Gold and Silver Prices?" And I checked on a Google search. I Google searched the exact title of that article, and it appeared in 27,700 results, meaning 27,700 other websites had republished links to my article, or republished what we've allowed, which is the first couple paragraphs of the article with a link back. And it appeared actually at that time I think we were even allowing the full publication of our articles, so it was 2-3 years ago, and it appeared at 27,700 results. So I conducted this search on March 23rd, 2015 again, and it only yielded 4,300 results. So somehow Google found it upon themselves to purge 23,400 results of their article from their search engine. Now, it's just not that. In December 2011, when the height of all this information I'm telling you, people were understanding how criminal the banking system is. Here's the exact search I conducted for a few of the world's biggest banks. I conducted a search for the bank name, crimes. So, for example, I conducted a search for Citigroup, crimes. 37,700,000 results. This was back in December 20th of 2011. Today, or at least I conducted on March 23rd, 2015, so just a couple months ago, the exact same search yielded only slightly over 500,000 results. So they purged 37,200,000 results of examples of articles that were exposing Citigroup criminal activity. Goldman Sachs, crimes. Back then, 41,800,000 results. Today, 488,000 results. HSBC, crimes. 14,400,000 results. Today, slightly over 500,000 results. UBS, crimes. 74,700,000 results. Today, again, just 516,000 results in the Google search engine. Bank of America, crimes. 2011, 133 million results. Today, I guess Bank of America has done a bad job of purging their criminal activity from the internet, because it still yields 51,600,000 results. But they're the only one, because Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, respectively, back then, over 7.2 million and 11.4 million results. Again, today, only 500,000 and 421,000 and 510,000 results, respectively. So all the other banks have purged millions and millions, literally 30 million, 70 million, 14 million results from their search, from the Google search engine. And I guess, although Bank of America went down from 133 million to 51 million, so they still purged roughly 82 million results from the search engine. So that is a big problem with people not understanding the truth about banks today, because everyone is able, and I'm not really certain, but I do remember at one point Google was allowing corporations to purge unflattering results from the search engine. So maybe all these other big banks, through their public relations department, allocated a lot of money to pay Google to purge these results. I'm not sure that that's what happened, but I do remember hearing that Google at some point was allowing people to, I think it was a paid service, I'm not sure, or maybe just allowing people to request offensive articles to them to be purged. So that is a huge problem with people understanding everything. But the big problem, which I'm saying for the end, is the largest problem in the banking industry today, although this hardly covers, but it's going to be the last topic I talk about. It hardly covers all the problems with banks today. It ties back to all of the previous topics. So kind of, as you all know, if you've been listening to my podcast, I'm a big believer in connecting all the dots, and this kind of connects all the dots and brings all these topics back in line with one singular massive problem of the banking industry, and that's that bankers have enforced a system of counterfeit money upon all of us. And people always say, what is counterfeit money? Well, if you look up the Webster's dictionary definition of counterfeit, It basically satisfies all the qualities of what is counterfeit, the type of money we use today. So only gold is real money. And every single problem I've discussed above is because bankers have imposed a system of fraudulent currency upon us. If we use real money, we wouldn't have all of these problems that I've just spoke about in this podcast and the banking system today. Trust me. So let me read you some congressional testimony from Ron Paul in 2000 so you can form an idea of what real money is if you don't know, because there's certain qualities that all money should have, and if they don't have it, it's not real money. And we certainly are not using real money anywhere in the world today. So this is congressional testimony that Ron Paul gave to, at the time, Fed Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan back in 2000. So he said, let me try to get to the meat of his testimony. Okay, he said, I think a characteristic of paper money, of fiat money, is that some benefit and others lose. Actually, I believe it's only like the 0.1% of people benefit and everyone else loses from paper money. A good example of this is how Wall Street benefits. Certainly Wall Street is doing very well. Just the other day, I had one of my shrimpers in my district call me and say he is tying up his boat. His oil prices have more than doubled and he cannot afford it, so now he will have to close down shop. So he suffers more than the person on Wall Street. So it is an unfair system. This unfairness is not unusual. This characteristic is well known, that when you destroy and debase a currency, some people will suffer more than others. Again, I think it's 99.9% of people that suffer, and just the 0.1% of the top bankers and industrialists become a lot richer. We have concentrated here a lot today on prices. You talk a lot about the price of labor. Yeah, that is not the inflation according to sound money economics, which I always advocate sound money. The concern the sound money economist has is for the supply of money. If you increase the supply of money, you have inflation. Just because you're able to maintain a price level of a certain level because of technology or for some other reason, this should not be a reassurance, because we still can have our malinvestment, our excessive debt and borrowing. It might contribute even to the margin debt in these various things. So I think we should concentrate, especially since we are dealing with monetary policy, more on monetary policy and what we are doing with money. So again, we don't have any real money in the system. I believe that if all of you that are listening to this podcast disagree with anything I say, or if you disagree with everything I say, again, the way to really come to the truth is to do your own research. Because I've had people argue with me, okay, when I've argued some of these points, they say, well, that's not what Paul Krugman said, and he won a Nobel Prize in economics. Are you smarter than a Nobel Prize winning economist? That shows me that person has zero capacity to think logically, because that is not a logical argument to why I'm wrong. He did not factually disprove anything that I told him, but his all argument was based upon blind trust in someone that the bankers have pushed to the forefront as an expert. And I've heard that again with Warren Buffett, because I'll say, the dumbest argument ever is that gold has no intrinsic value. But I say, Warren Buffett says gold is a barbarous relic. And are you smarter than a billionaire? Warren Buffett has made billions. Are you smarter than a billionaire? Again, zero logic. So even if you are skeptical of everything I say, please do your own research, because I am convinced that if you fight the propensity to say everything I have said is wrong because you've been taught otherwise through school, through what you learned on TV and mass media, that you're skeptical is like 99% on a scale of 1 to 100%, that if you do your own research, then you will come to the opposite side to realize what the truth really is. And for those that already know the truth, and this really angers you, this information, this podcast, the last message I want to give out is that I think it's counterproductive to take an us versus them stance. And I believe that because we are strong enough, 7 billion people can conquer like the 5,000 terrible bankers and prime ministers and presidents and parliament members and congressmen that are running all the countries in this world. We are more than strong enough to defeat them in a peaceful manner if we all take action. That if we shirk our personal responsibility to be part of the solution, then I think it is within everyone's right to say that we are part of the problem if we're not going to be part of the solution. So rather than take an us versus them stance, which I think is counterproductive, I think that we should all look at it as we're part of the problem too. True, we're probably not a part of the problem as great as the bankers are, but we can't just say, oh, they're the problem and we're not part of the problem, because we truly do have the power to build the future that we desire. We just have to take that, because, for example, part of the solution is just converting some of your savings into physical gold, not paper gold, into physical gold. And a lot of people that I've told and explained to them why this could bring the banking system down, help us implement sound money and an honest banking system that has integrity, like the 6909 Municipal Bank of Amsterdam, versus this crime-ridden, infested, bottom-of-the-barrel banking system we have today. A lot of people say, I understand exactly what you're telling me, but it's just so inconvenient. I don't want to deal with the inconvenience. So again, we're part of the problem. We're not willing to deal with a little inconvenience to change the situation for what it is today. We are part of the problem, and we cannot, I truly strongly believe, we cannot blame the bankers if we're not willing to be part of the solution. If we're willing to be part of the solution, okay, I'll give you a little leeway to blame the bankers for all these massive economic problems in South America, North America, and Europe, and Asia, and Africa, but I still don't believe we should make it a us versus them, because it's very, very counterproductive. I think we should all try to work together. And even bankers, we shouldn't just condemn them, but we can say, hey, look, go research the 1609 Municipal Bank of Amsterdam. Say, this is what an honest bank should be like. So you can't tell me there's an excuse not to exit the system, because what you could do, you have the knowledge to build an honest banking industry. So take all your multi-million dollar executives with you. You don't need that money. You don't need money. You already have made $5-6 million a year for the past 10 years. And then do something good with your life for the rest of your life to make up for all the destruction that you imposed upon us for the last decade. And form a new bank and show the world how a real honest bank should operate. And you can take that knowledge and flip this banking industry on its head, so everyone can be part of the solution. And I think that's what we should be working towards. That's just my message today, is we should all be working toward this solution. Okay, thanks so much for listening today. As always, remain intensely curious. Also note that if you want to download the MP3, I will also post this on iTunes. Just search podcast for Smart Knowledge U. You will find this podcast if you want to download it as an MP3 file and listen to it on your mobile phone or on your iPod. Thanks a lot for listening. Please don't forget, comment below. Again, tell me what kind of topics you want to hear in the future. Please also give us a like if you like it. Like us. Give us a dislike if you disliked us. But the important thing is also to spread this information as far and wide as possible, because we need to get the truth out there. And that's, once more people know the truth, I believe we will move from a state of inertia, and a paralysis, which we are in today, to a state of mobility, a state of action, a state of personal responsibility. And that's how we will bring about the change we really desire in this world. Okay, until next time, so long and have a great day.